So yes, as Daria said, my name's Daniel Papps from the United Services Union. We are one of the larger local government employees unions in Australia. We primarily operate in the most populous state, which is New South Wales on the eastern seaboard of Australia. We have roughly 30,000 members out of a local government workforce of around about 50,000 in New South Wales. So we have fairly good density, but we are looking obviously to grow that density. And one of the primary ways we're trying to do that moving forward is our council services by council workers campaign, which is, I think, at its heart, a remunicipalisation and insourcing campaign. So if I could just get the next slide up, Hazel, thanks. So fundamentally, what is the problem? It is sort of trite to say that it is a problem about outsourcing and privatisation. Like lots of countries that have engaged in a neoliberal project over the last 20 or 30 years, we've had this creeping circumstance of outsourcing and privatising of both local government services and state and federal services. Now, at least in Australia and in New South Wales in particular, there are a number of specific factors which I think have halted some of the insourcing trends that Andy spoke about earlier. And primarily that is this two-tiered system of employment regulation that operates in Australia and New South Wales. At a national level, we have an employment regulation system which applies to employees of corporations, which is somewhere in the order of 95% of all employees in Australia. And then at state or provincial level, we have employment regulations which apply to historically state or local government run workforces, so your police officers, doctors, nurses, teachers, and council workers. What this creates is a really perverse set of incentives. So with the national or federal employment regulation system, there's been a pretty significant shift away from collective bargaining. Unions have been, on the whole, moved away from that process, and we've seen a pretty significant shift and downgrading in employment conditions, both from a perspective of wages and employment security. On the other side, we have in the state system, unions are central to the negotiating process. Employers have to negotiate with unions. And as a result, we've seen a fairly significant growth in employment conditions and wages. So local government employees in New South Wales that are directly employed by local governments are working under the state system with, on the whole, better conditions and wages. So what that creates is an incentive for local governments to outsource their work to corporate entities that fall under this federal system, which traditionally sees employee costs cut through a reduction in wages and conditions. Now, that obviously has an initial and upfront appeal to some local government entities. They can see an opportunity to cut costs in the short term. But I think, as we would all sort of agree, that does create some long-term trends in both quality of service, but also in removing wages from the community that ultimately has some long-term economic consequences. Just next slide, please. So why have we decided to prioritise this issue for our union? At a purely ideological level, it's because outsourcing and contracting results in inferior wages and conditions for workers. And that's not just our members, that's any worker in New South Wales, and that's something that we obviously don't want to support. It's not part of the union movement, which is focused on solidarity. But from a somewhat more cynical or selfish perspective, outsourcing poses a real existential threat to our union due to issues of recruitment, membership, and growth. So we have an aging local government workforce in New South Wales. The average age of an employee is something in the order of 55 years of age. And I think the average age of our member is something closer to 58 or 60 years of age. So in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see a significant exodus from both the industry and our organisation as people start to retire. And unless we can repopulate the local government workforce with directly employed local government workers, we are going to suffer a real significant membership drop because of the way our organisation operates. We do not have capacity to represent necessarily those employees of contract organisations. So we really need to see the local government industry as a direct employment relationship grow in order to see our organisation grow and in order to drive good wages and condition outcomes for workers across New South Wales. So this was a really easy sell internally for us to make this a primary campaign for us moving forward. Our union executive committee, which is sort of the chief guiding force of our organisation, is made up of rank and file members working at local government organisations across New South Wales. They are living the outsourcing and privatisation problem on a day-to-day basis, and they were keen to see this form part of a coordinated and really structured approach to campaigning moving into the next election cycle. And our General Secretary has made it clear to all of us that this is the campaign for us as we move forward. Next slide, please, Hazel. So how are we trying to organise our workers in conjunction with this campaign? Now, I will say it has been a little bit difficult, particularly recently. New South Wales has gone through a fairly harsh set of restrictions associated with the COVID pandemic, associated with our movement and our capacity to visit work sites to organise workers. We are just starting to emerge from some of those harsher restrictions now. So it is my hope that we can start to visit work sites and organise in a face-to-face model as opposed to the online model we've been operating in the last 3 or so months. But we really want to focus on leveraging the power of our geographic branch structure. So when I say our geographic branch structure, we truly are a bottom-up organisation. We have workplace delegates and representatives in every local government organisation in New South Wales, both from large cities into regional towns and bigger regional centres. And they form geographic-based committees and branches which really inform what we do. So our focus is really engaging those individuals who work in these workplaces, who live these issues on a day-to-day basis, to become engaged in the issue. We have done that through a number of means, surveying those members, getting them to collect the information that we need to be able to drive some of these campaigns at a bigger level. And what we're really focusing on coming into the end of this year is the local government elections, which are currently scheduled, all things being equal with our pandemic response in our opening for December 2021. Next slide, please. So when we talk about how we want to drive good outcomes of remunicipalising services and insourcing in local government, the focus for us is really on the elected councillors who make these decisions at each local government area. The enabling legislation for most councils in New South Wales makes the decision to both outsource and insource services a decision of the elected council. Now, each council has a different makeup, but it is somewhere between 8 and 12 elected individuals who are elected on 4 yearly cycles. Now, that has some benefits, but also some pretty significant issues. It means that decisions to outsource can really be swayed by the prevailing political winds at the time. If there is a state government, which we currently do have, which are big proponents of privatisation, you will see a flurry of decisions to outsource services. But it also means that if we can run effective campaigns and change 2 or 3 minds on a council, or get 2 or 3 allies elected to a council, we can get some really significant wins and really drive some good decision making in terms of bringing services back in-house. Next slide. So moving into the 2021 local government elections, we are rolling out a couple of fairly simple, fairly basic kind of tools that we are hoping will drive some favourable election results for us. So we've rolled out a candidate pledge, which we're asking all people who are nominating to run for the local government elections in December to sign. The pledge really just commits them to keeping services in-house and bringing other services back in-house. We've had at this stage, I think, about 270 of the something like 450 candidates who have signed that pledge. So it's over a 50% take-up rate, which is really good. We're also rolling out election material, both in how to vote materials, in signs, in trucks, that we will start deploying in the next few weeks in key local government areas where we really think we can drive some positive electoral results. Now, we do in New South Wales have some pretty strict campaign financing regulations, so we are limited in some respects as to how much money we can devote to these sorts of campaigns, but I think a focus on being mobile and digital is really going to help us stretch that kind of funding and get bang for our buck moving forward. Next slide. So just I'll finish on this, Daria, because I know everyone's pressed for time. Just a couple of really big recent wins. So Canterbury Bankstown Council, which is at least by population the largest local government area in Australia, it's got over 350,000 residents, returned its domestic waste collection to a completely in-house model. So that accounts for probably 40 or 50 jobs that have returned to the more secure, more protected local government environment. From a big picture standpoint, 40 or 50 jobs doesn't really sound like a lot, but I think given the size of the council, we're hoping that we can leverage that to have a bit of a momentum swing, and we can start to topple a few other big contracts in neighbouring councils. We've also managed to, and I think this is really significant, at least for us, get the state government to require local councils to report on how many contractors they engage in any one financial year. It's previously not been a requirement, and what we've actually discovered is the outsourcing problem is a little bit of a hidden problem in New South Wales. If you talk to senior leaders at councils, they will tell you that they don't have great oversight on how many contractors they engage, because it's that middle level of management who largely make the decision to engage contractors, and they're typically doing that to try and avoid get around employment freezes and staff hiring issues. So they're hiding these contracts in line items in their budget. So when we're engaging with leaders of these organisations, they actually can't tell us what the problem is. But we're hopeful that by requiring councils to be a bit more self-aware about the kind of problem that they have and to report on that information, we can both alert these organisations to the problem within their own ranks, but also be a bit more aware of where the real key points are. So it's no longer a hidden issue. It's something we're trying to bring into a more transparent discussion with both electors in the area and people who use the service, so they can understand who's providing their work, whether it's an in-sourced or an outsourced service. And then we hope can draw some parallels between the quality of the service they provide, which can kind of drive some more positive decision-making at that elected level. So Daria, that's really all I had to say. I'm happy to take questions now or later, but it is approaching 11 o'clock on a Friday night. So I would get off at a convenient time if I can, but thank you.